Hello, my name is Gavin Bamford. I'm Chair of History Hub Ulster. I welcome you all to this Zoom presentation given by Nigel Henderson, who is part of the History Hub Ulster team, Steven Jaffe, a friend of ours, and Richard Graham, who is also a member of our team. We hope you enjoy it, and over to Steven now.
Thank you very much, Gavin. On behalf of the Jewish community, I'd like to say a big thank you to the History Hub Ulster for hosting this event, and to Nigel and Richard, not only for your presentations that we're going to hear today, but for your ongoing work in promoting the history of the Belfast Jewish community, in particular, all the stuff that you put online and the positive interest that that's generated. It's hugely important, I think, and very much appreciated. Now, if you go and visit the Cenotaph in London on the Sunday following Remembrance Sunday, you will see a parade by an organisation called AJEX. That's Anglo-Jewish ex-servicemen and women. It's a Jewish commemoration for remembrance of our war dead, when special prayers, including the Kaddish prayer, can be said for those who lost their lives in the war. Now, for many years at that parade, you would have seen a standard of the Belfast branch of AJEX, and Belfast Jews would have been marching on that parade. When I was growing up in Belfast as a member of the Jewish community, we had a remembrance service in the synagogue, and people came from both from within the Jewish community and outside it. And in more recent years, because the Jewish community now is tiny, only 70 members in Belfast, what we have is on the Shabbat, on the Sabbath service closest to Remembrance Sunday, the names of our dead would be read out. So in the context of a Jewish community now which is so small, I think the work that you're doing, Nigel, to remember the dead of the Jewish community of Belfast in the World Wars, to memorialise them, is, well, it's very, very moving, and I think very, very important. I've been asked to say a few words about the attitudes to the Jewish community in what is now Northern Ireland at the onset of the First World War. And it was really a community of newcomers. Having said that, the leadership of the community at that time were quite long established. The Belfast Jewish community dates from the 1860s, and the first synagogue in Belfast was opened in 1871. The leader of the Jewish community in 1914 was a man called Sir Otto Jaffe. He was twice Lord Mayor of Belfast. He was High Sheriff. He was very much a philanthropist, a leading citizen who, for example, supported education in Belfast. He was a pioneer in the opening of the Belfast Technical College, a strong supporter of that. He was on the Senate of Queen's University. Jaffe School on the Cliftonville Road was opened by him and his wife. He was involved in the hospitals, in various charitable institutions in Belfast, a leading citizen. But Sir Otto was German by birth. He had been Germany's honorary consul in Belfast up until 1914. And you can imagine how that put him in a difficult position, to say the least, when war was declared. There was a lot of suspicion against Sir Otto Jaffe. We know that. We see the evidence in contemporary diaries, in minute books of various Belfast organisations, in correspondence with leading politicians in the papers of Winston Churchill, who was First Lord of the Admiralty. Somebody from Belfast had written to say that they'd seen Sir Otto down at the docks, and he was drawing pictures of British battleships to send over to the Germans. It was nonsense, of course, but you can understand the fears, the apprehensions, the emotions which war engenders. After the sinking of the Lusitania in 1915, there was a wave of anti-German feeling across the British Isles, and it's said that Sir Otto Jaffe's carriage was stoned on the streets of Belfast. He wrote to the local newspapers to protest his loyalty to the British cause. He pointed out that he had cousins serving in the French army. His son was an officer in the British army, but it didn't do any good, and in 1916, he was forced to leave Belfast. But I said the community were newly arrived, and this was because there was a second wave of immigration of Jews to Belfast, really from the 1880s and 1890s onwards. These were Jews coming from further Eastern Europe, from Lithuania, from Poland, then part of the Russian Empire. They were obviously foreign in language. They spoke Yiddish, foreign in appearance. Many of them were door-to-door peddlers, so they were quite visible in the streets of Belfast and beyond. In terms of numbers, I would say there were approximately about 1,000 Jews in what is today Northern Ireland at the time. Most of them lived in North Belfast, in that area of the lower Crumlin Road, the Old Lodge Road. And again, because they were foreign, there was suspicion directed against them. There's a very interesting letter written to the Jewish Chronicle from Newry, from a member of the Abrahamson family, writing just after the outbreak of war. He said all of a sudden the Jews of Newry, from being described as being Russian Jews, were now being called German Jews. He talked about a strong fear that he had that they would face violent hostility, and he called upon the Jewish leadership in London to act to protect small Jewish communities around the British Isles. We know that one or two members of the Jewish community in Belfast were interned as enemy aliens if they were Austrian citizens. So in that context of a foreign community, were the youngsters in the community, if they were Belfast born, their parents were coming from Eastern Europe. Given the fact that there was no conscription in Ireland at the time, it is truly remarkable that so many of the young members of the Belfast Jewish community joined the armed forces to play their part in the Great War, and we will obviously hear more about that from Nigel. The minute books of the Belfast Jewish community state that there were 35 members of the community serving in 1918. And I really look forward to hearing from Nigel some of their individual stories. So if I could hand over to you, Nigel.
Thank you, Stephen. I'm going to start off with a couple of ladies from the Jewish community who served in the First World War. Louis and Minnie Drieben, who were born in Russia, and 5 of their children were living at Duncairn Gardens in 1911, and then at Cliftonville Avenue in the 1918 Belfast Street Directory. Louis, or Lewis, was a grain cargo superintendent, so he'd been working in Belfast docks, checking cargoes that were being delivered. 2 of the children were born in England, 2 in Rhodesia, and 1 in Transvaal. 2 of the daughters served with the Voluntary Aid Detachment, which was an umbrella organisation for the British Red Cross and for the St. John of Jerusalem Ambulance Brigade. And basically they provided support services on a social level and also in hospitals, both in Ireland, United Kingdom, and indeed in battle zones or theatres of war. Annie Drieben was born around 1892 and volunteered to serve with the Voluntary Aid Detachments in March 1916. She undertook clerical and nursing duties at £20 per annum, which is approximately £1,948 in current terms on a whole-time basis. She served at a military hospital in Belfast and later at the South African Hospital in Richmond, and she was still on the books of the VAD in June 1919. As you can see from the her card, her address is given as 16 North Parade, Whitley Bay, Northumberland, just behind where it shows, yep. And in here, you've got a record that Belfast was recorded and then has been stroked out. So at some stage, the Drieben family moved back to England, probably before 1917. Her sister Sylvia was born around 1895 and she volunteered in September 1916. She undertook nursing duties at £12 per annum initially, rising to £22 per annum on a whole-time basis. She initially served in one of the UVF hospitals in Belfast, and during the war period there were several in Belfast. The best known one is Craigavon House in East Belfast, but there were also UVF hospitals at Botanic and at Hilden in Galwally, and also there was one in Guildford in County Down. She later served at the South African Hospital in Richmond, like her sister, and at the Second General Southern Hospital in Bristol. Sylvia left the VAD in June 1919, and again, her address is recorded initially as Belfast, but then as North Parade. So we can assume that perhaps that the Dreeben family had moved to the east coast of England, certainly by 1918, 1919. Moving on to the more military aspects. The first family I'm going to look at is the Burvitz family. In 1901, Louis Burvitz, a furniture merchant, and his wife Augusta and 4 children were living at Vicinage Park in the Clifton ward, which is North Belfast. Although the census records that all members of the family were born in Russia, their 2 youngest children were actually born in Belfast. The family was living at Kinnaird Terrace, not far from the synagogue in Annesley Street, by 1908. 2 members of the family served during the Great War, and later on in this presentation, Richard Graham will pick up on the history of the Burvitz family and the history, a general history of the Jewish community in Belfast. These are the 2 Burvitz brothers who served, and the one whose face is circled is Emmanuel Burvitz, also known as Mandy, who was born on 27th November 1897 at Carlisle Street in North Belfast. He played for Fort William Rugby Club, and he enlisted with the North Irish Horse at the end of August 1914. So within weeks of the war starting, Mandy Burvitz had enlisted with the North Irish Horse. And he enlisted at the age of 16, so he had understated his age. On 20th January 1915, he embarked for France with a small reinforcement draft and was assigned as orderly to the commanding officer of the North Irish Horse, who was Lord Mazarine, which is a lordship near Antrim. Mandy Burvitz remained with the regiment throughout the war and was transferred to the Class Z Army Reserve on the 27th of January 1919. For those listeners unfamiliar with the military terminology, the Class Z Army Reserve meant that if the peace negotiations had broken down, and if war had restarted, he would have been eligible to be immediately recalled to active service in a theatre of war. He was an active member of the North Irish Horse Old Comrades Association and what was known at that time as the Association of Jewish Ex-Servicemen and Women, which Stephen has already alluded to. He was also a past master of Sholom Masonic Lodge 636, which was until very recently still active in the White Abbey part of Belfast. Charles Burvitz was born on 20th June 1895, and he received a commission with the 15th Battalion, the King's Liverpool Regiment, in May 1915. He was deployed to the Western Front in June 1916, and he was attached to a trench mortar battery. On 21st August 1916, he was admitted to a base hospital in Bologna, having sustained an accidental gunshot wound to the eye, which later resulted in the loss of one of his eyes. Charles Burvitz relinquished his commission with effect from 24th May 1918, and in addition to a wounds pension, he received a pension of £3 per month. Charles Burvitz is commemorated on the Roll of Honour for Belfast Royal Academy, although his brother Emmanuel or Mandy is not recorded on that Roll of Honour, so we don't know what school Emmanuel Burvitz attended. The Freeman family. Abraham and Rhoda Freeman had emigrated from what is now Lithuania in the early 1890s. In 1901, Abraham, Rhoda, and 5 of their 10 children were living at Cecil Street in Uri. Eli, the youngest, was born at Edward Street in Uri on the 28th of January 1894, and the next youngest child, Louis, was 11 and recorded as having been born in Russia. So that gives us a timescale for when the Freeman family arrived in Ireland. Abraham Freeman was a drapery dealer, and he died of cancer of the stomach and pneumonia at Kilmorey Street in Uri on the 11th of December 1907 at the age of 62. In 1911, Rhoda and Eli Freeman were living at Avoca Street in Belfast. 3 of the Freeman's sons served in the Great War, and this combined picture from the Belfast Evening Telegraph shows the 3 young lads. Louis Freeman enlisted with the 14th Battalion Royal Irish Rifles on 12 September 1914 and was discharged as permanently unfit for war service on 12 May 1915 with a Silver War Badge. Again, for those not familiar with the military terminology, Silver War Badge was issued to men discharged due to either wounds or illness that were attributed to their war service. Louis had a medical condition called fibrous ankylosis, which was an abnormal stiffening and immobility of the joints due to fusion of the bones. The Army Medical Corps did carry out an operation to try and alleviate the condition, but they were unable to so to do. Louis's condition resulted in the loss of power in his right hand, which obviously would have affected his efficiency as a soldier. Joseph Freeman in 1911 was a credit draper and was boarding with his sister Florence and her husband, the Mendel family, at Kilmorey Terrace in Uri. Joseph Freeman joined the Queen's University Officers Training Corps and received a commission with 6th Battalion Royal Irish Rifles. He would have participated in the campaigns at Gallipoli, Salonika in northern Greece against the Bulgarians, and probably Palestine. Unfortunately, his record at the National Archives has not been digitized, so we can't identify exactly which engagements he was involved in. Michael Isaac or Ike Freeman was living in Glasgow and was a member of the Glasgow Chamber of Commerce when he enlisted with the 17th Battalion, the Highland Light Infantry. This was also known as the 3rd Glasgow Battalion. The extant military documentation always records his name as Michael, although within the family he would have been Isaac or Ike. Michael landed in France on 22nd November 1915 and died on 2nd July 1916, the second day of the Battle of Albert, which was the opening phase of the 1916 Battles of the Somme. In his will, he left his flat in Glasgow to Arthur Montefiore Cohen, who was in the same battalion and regiment, and he survived the war. His mother received a war gratuity of £8 on 19 September 1919, and that would be the equivalent of £432 in current terms, the value placed on a man's life. Rhoda Freeman was also received a pension of 15 shillings per week from the 4th of April 1917, and in today's terms that would be £62 a week. In 1901, Louis and Sarah Goldie and 5 children were living at Crown Street in the Gorbals district of Glasgow. Based on the recorded ages and places of birth, the Goldie family had emigrated from Russia between 1894, when Mary was born, and 1897, when Barney was born in Aberdeen. In 1901, Louis Goldie was recorded as being a general peddler, which Stephen has already alluded to. That was quite a common occupation for members of the Jewish community, especially those who had emigrated from Eastern Europe. In 1907, Louis Goldie is recorded as being an agent and living at Mountview Street in the Clifton ward. And in 1912, he was recorded as being a commercial traveller and living at 19 Baden-Powell Street. Barney enlisted with the Royal Irish Fusiliers and was deployed to the 1st Battalion on the Western Front sometime after 31st December 1915. He died of wounds at No. 6 General Hospital in Rouen on 22nd October 1916, aged approximately 19, and is buried in the St. Saviour Cemetery. This is his gravestone in the cemetery, and alongside it is his will, his army will. His mother received a war gratuity of £6 in October 1919, which would be the equivalent of £324 in current terms. If you can see the will clearly, you can see that there's a shadowing effect, and to my eye, it looks like somebody has written the words in pencil, and then Barney has overwritten the penciled words in ink, so that it's written in his hand, but obviously he would not have been able to write it himself without the background lettering. And you can see there that he dated his will the 18th of March 1916. So really just a few months before he died, he dated his will. Probably he made his will just before a previous engagement with which his battalion was involved, but that is supposition on my part. Samuel Gorfunkel was a widower with one son when he emigrated to England in the early 1870s, becoming a naturalised citizen in 1874. He married Hilda Levinson, who had also emigrated from Poland to England in the early 1870s. In 1901, Samuel and Hilda and 10 of their children were living at Duncairn Street in the Clifton ward. 9 of their children are recorded as being born at Liverpool, with their last child, Philip, being born in Belfast in 1897. In 1911, the family was living on the Antrim Road. Pardon me. The family was living on the Antrim Road, and Samuel's business premises were located in York Street. 2 members of the Gorfunkel family served in the Great War. Isaac Gorfunkel was employed by Gregg and Company Timber Merchants of Exchange Street when he received a commission with the Lancashire Fusiliers in March 1915. He was deployed to the 1st Battalion on the Gallipoli Peninsula in September 1915, and in December of the same year, the Belfast newsletter reported that Isaac had been evacuated to hospital in Malta, suffering from frostbite. We tend to think of Gallipoli as being a very hot area, but by December, his battalion would have been probably in Salonika, in the mountains of Salonika. He rejoined his battalion after its redeployment to the Western Front and was a company commander from September 1917. Captain Isaac Gorfunkel was killed in action on 12th August 1918 and is buried in the Uterstein Communal Cemetery Extension at Balliol in France. I don't have much information about his brother Philip, other than he was born on 6th January 1897 at Duncairn Street. He was a cadet when he received a commission with the Royal Irish Rifles in December 1916, and he was deployed to the Western Front on 8th March 1917. I don't know what battalion he was attached to or when he relinquished his commission, but that's the information that we have on Philip Gorfunkel. Cecil Marcus. Theodore Marcus was born in Ronin in Russian Poland and married Laura Stern in late 1889 in Liverpool. He was a house furnisher when he became a naturalised British citizen in 1891. Theodore was recorded as being a financier in 1908 when the family was living at Haslam Villas on the Antrim Road. The family had moved to Dunvara on Clifton Park Avenue by 1910. Cecil Marcus was born around 1896 and he studied at the Belfast Municipal Technical Institute, the institute with which Sir Otto Jaffe was closely associated. And that's where this photograph comes from, the institute's archives. He studied there between 1910 and 1912, and then he enlisted for war service with the 14th Battalion Royal Irish Rifles and was deployed to France with the Ulster Division in October 1915. He ended his war service with a depot battalion of the Jewish Brigade in the Royal Fusiliers Regiment, which was a London-based regiment. Hans Sergei and Jenny Mann were both born in Russia, as were 4 of their 7 children, the others being born in Belfast. Bennett Sergei was born in Belfast on 12th November 1892, although the birth register records his forename as Bernard and his surname as spelt Sergay. The family was living in Donegal Pass in 1901, and Harris Sergei became a naturalized UK citizen in 1904. The family later moved to the Ormer Road, but Bennett is not listed on the census return for 1911. It is known that he enlisted in Cincinnati on the 15th of December 1917 and was a machinist's mate, 2nd class, in the United States Air Service. In October 1918, he was stationed at the Killingholme Royal Naval Air Service Station on the Humber Estuary. While on patrol along the east coast of England on 11th of October 1918, 1 month before the armistice, the H-16 flying boat on which Bennett Sergei was the gunner developed engine failure and crashed into the sea with the loss of 2 lives. Bennett Sergei was 26 years old, and a joint Christian and Jewish funeral service for the men that died was held at the base. Before that service, Rabbi Samuel Gross conducted a final private funeral rite for Bennett's Jewish comrades and read the burial service in the public service. One of Bennett's Jewish comrades accompanied the coffin on its return journey to Belfast, where Bennett Sergei was laid to rest in the Jewish burial ground at Carnmoney with full military honours. My thanks to Richard Graham, who will follow me, for the photograph of the Sergei headstone, which features a carving of a biplane.